Hello, I'm Toycat, and the 4th of July is when the United States of America officially celebrates its independence. But its independence from who, you might be asking? Well, actually, the United Kingdom. As someone from the UK, this fact actually shocked me when I learned it years ago, because how does an island this size control a continent this size, but also the world's foremost economic, military, and media power? Well, also, let me tell you, I was shocked when I learned about the rest of it too, but it is an incredibly interesting fact that British people like to brush over and joke about, saying, ha ha ha, good riddance, all those Yanks. And the United States, of course, defines their identity in some small part to being independent from the UK, but it's not just a thing which is good for one country or the other. I think the US leaving the UK was not just a great thing to happen for the US or the UK, but was actually one of the best things that could have happened for either country, and indeed was the best thing that did happen to both. And let me explain why today, because it did lead to many of the things you take for granted that wouldn't have happened if the US never left the UK. So this is a fun hypothetical history by explaining a bit of the US's history, and we'll have to go back to the very start, not to 1986 when this photo was taken, but instead to 1776, because that is when the United States, the 13 colonies, decided they wanted to be independent. And it has to be worth mentioning that even just during the Independence War, which I don't think this is a controversial view to say, that the Independence War mostly happened because the UK was busy in Europe, and also because France, one of the UK's traditional biggest enemies in Europe at the time, decided that helping their colonies gain independence was a worthwhile cause. This is something the US did very well to secure, and ultimately was a pretty great thing, because when the peace treaty was signed, this is what the 13 colonies looked like before, and this is what the 13 colonies looked like afterwards in 1783. That is a huge expansion from the treaty. I mean, again, look at the 13 colonies, basically doubling in size, more than even, going from 13 states to what would eventually be a lot more. This was a big win right off the bat. The US got a lot bigger just by gaining independence, and ultimately this land was only freshly the UK's anyway. Most of this territory used to be France's. It was won just before the War of Independence, and so the UK giving it to the US was seemingly like a concession, and France sure saw it that way. Haha, you don't get to keep that territory you kept from us. But on the other hand, it actually was something the UK saw as maybe something worth doing, partially because now they didn't have to, retain the land from France, but most importantly, the much more important factor was that now the US having such a strong footing would make it a strong trading partner. In fact, the US and the UK, the British Empire had a favourable trading policy amongst itself, a favourable trading policy which they let the US in on. There's something called a most favoured nation in trading in international terms. The US and the UK were able to be such strong trading partners, and still are to this day, because the UK gave the US most favourable nation status, basically giving it that trade link that the empire, that made the empire good in the ways that it was good. We're not going to talk too much about colonialism today, but it gave it that status that allowed it to have the benefits of staying in, but still be independent in its own way. And so that is precisely what it did, and it led to a lot of strong trade that boosted the US and the UK. Obviously, at the start of the relationship in 1783, the 13 colonies were not a big power in the world. Even with all this extra land, they were still nothing compared to most European powers. Again, not a controversial statement, that's just kind of how it was. But this is what led to the kind of crazy expansion across the continent that was so good to their success. Also, by the way, that it's funny because that alliance with France, which led to basically not only gaining independence, but then the Treaty of Paris. You can guess where that was signed, by the way. If you guessed Paris, Texas, then you'd be right. But that signing of the treaty, which obviously happened, in Paris, France, apparently. By the way, that's a fun American thing, is saying the country after you say something, like, oh yeah, I'm going to Stockholm, Sweden, as opposed to the Stockholm somewhere else. Because in the US, there actually is a ton of weird things like that, where you would have to say the state or the country after it. Just a fun little tidbit while we're celebrating American independence anyway. But yeah, so the US does all of this, and France is on board with it because it gains them a powerful new ally in the new world. And how long do you think that ally, the ally they have to go through so much fighting for, the ally they give up basically a lot of land for, indirectly for, how long do you think that alliance lasts? Because if you guessed about 17 years, you guessed correctly. The Quasi War was a war between the US and France. Obviously, the US and the UK fought a war as well. It was pretty bad in the sense that, the White House burned down, and it was pretty bad in that basically nothing happened, nothing seriously exchanged hands. The US really had the plan of coming into Canada and claiming it for their own, but that never happened either. The long story short, this one is like, yeah, the US and the UK both fought a war, the UK and France both fought wars with America, but after these fairly short-lived wars, the US basically retreated into a place of isolationism, which is a place they kind of want to go back to a lot today, but this allowed them to be strong in that they don't have to fight wars. And so, the Louisiana Purchase happens, and it's like, yeah, there's this huge bunch of territory France has. They worry it's gonna fall to the UK, and they, it's something they're probably gonna lose in the war anyway. They need to fund some stuff, so they sell the biggest land purchase in world history to the US at discount, bargain basement prices, solely so that other countries can't have it. Something that never would have happened if France was, if this was part of the UK, France would have never sold this much land. They would have made the UK fight and die for it. And this is a thing that is a fun fact of like, well, the US goes independent, and now they can be a rival to the UK, despite kind of not being. I mean, at the time, Canada was still part of the UK. It was very much, they were rivals in some sense, but also they were being both countries were trading quite well with the UK, and everyone was quite happy with the arrangement, which means the US can grow, it can achieve its manifest destiny or whatever it wants to do, but without affecting the balance of power in Europe, which was the most crucial thing. The reason I keep saying, like, well, the Texas would not have been allowed to happen if Spain and, the Spanish cession wouldn't have happened if Spain was giving it to the UK. They're fine with giving it to this brand new country. The same with the Texas thing, and the same with basically all of these treaties. They wouldn't have happened with the UK because of something called the balance of power. Every European power had a strong view that no other power should be allowed to be too big. After you fight enough wars over enough centuries, you begin to realize the only way to prevent, overwhelming wins, the easiest way to prevent wars is kind of this mutually assured destruction. But before nuclear weapons, the idea behind achieving that was always making sure all the major powers in Europe were about on level. If one ever grew too big, the others would invade it and bring it down a peg, which is why the Napoleonic Wars happened, basically. France tried to expand across Europe all the way over there, and then the whole of Europe, this is one of those cool history facts to me, the whole of Europe comes together and goes, no, France, you can't do that, and kicks them back and exiles Napoleon to, if I'm not mistaken, the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean on St. Helena, right? This is where Napoleon had to die because we had to send him away because he fought a bunch of European wars. So the balance of power was incredibly important, and so letting any one European power grow too big would not have been okay. So if you look right here, even on a map, this looks balanced just by territory size, let alone all the resources that comes from it, etc. And so as a result, Europe had to stay balanced, but you know who's not in Europe? This is a fun fact that will blow your mind, and I'm not going to make a UK joke. We could make a joke about leaving the Europe, but instead we'll say, no, the US isn't in Europe, and so sell them your land. Sure, fight a war with them. Sure, sell them a little bit of your land or whatever. Ultimately, they did fight a war with Mexico, which wasn't part of New Spain anymore, but that was a war that Spain was probably interested in and would have been a lot more interested if it weren't for that. Alaska Purchase down here. Alaska was a giant piece of land bought from Russia at bargain basement price. Again, I really have to clarify over and over again just how cheap the United States got all this land for, because it wasn't a European power. Russia didn't have to worry about Great Britain growing too strong and giving it the land there, so instead it gives it to the US. Even the land, the only conflicts that the US and the UK really ever came to territorially is, as you can tell, this land used to be the UK, had to go to the US. This land used to be joint UK and US. The Oregon country is a fascinating story, by the way, and the US got a really good deal on it. All they had to give up was Vancouver Island, but ultimately that means that the US becomes very, very strong, mostly at the failure to other nations. France, Spain. I guess in this case, the native Hawaiians, and then Russia. European powers suffer, as you can see right here, so that the US can grow, and this is something that could not happen if it were part of Great Britain, which is something that works out very well in the UK's favour when it sort of has all the benefits and trade-offs of it being one. Sure, the UK doesn't directly get to dictate what happens in the US, and sometimes that leads to all sorts of wacky, situations, and I think it's better that way after looking at American politics. Let me tell you, the UK can't directly dictate what happens in the US. Ultimately, now the relationship works much the other way, but having a really close relationship, one of really, really close allies, built into the fabric of the nation while still officially being separate is one of the things that makes their relationship so powerful, and one of the things that ultimately makes the Anglosphere always inherently a little tied together. I mean, I've said this before, but one of the weird things everyone in every Anglophone nation feels is kind of an affinity to other countries. In fact, By the way, I also have mentioned the US getting all this territory is not just the only thing that happens. It also has the huge upside of its economy growing. So here is just historical GDP from the year 1 to 2003. And as you can see, the US does gain a little bit in like the 1700s. Sure, it probably would have become a fairly big colony of the UK, but instead by being independent, it surpasses all of Western Europe in the period where, you know, what was happening in 1940s Europe? Do you know? Could you let me know in the comments? Was there something in Europe that would cause the GDP to drop quite a bit there, but also allow the US's to go up? Could anyone let me know what was happening in Europe in early 1940s, maybe? It looks like very specifically there. Just leave me a comment, I'd love to know. But yeah, for now... Sorry, it's my favorite bit for these videos. I gotta keep doing it. But yeah, the US that allowed the US to gain massively. Whereas if you look at you know, you could say like, oh, whereas look at India, the other British colony, and look how bad that went. I mean, ultimately, if you look at China, which was colonized by no one, also had a huge dip in the same time, and even post-independence, India and China basically still haven't caught up, but they're going at very different rates despite having very different histories. There's a whole point about happening here, but the point is to say that like, yeah, if you look at this, the US would never have been allowed to be, you know, more than all of Western Europe combined if it were a part of the UK. Ultimately, maybe the world wars wouldn't have happened if the UK had all this power, but the UK never would have. At some point, a war would have happened to say, hey, why are we allowing one country to control that entire continent over there, as well as that entire continent over there, as well as all their territories across the rest of the world, the Middle East and Africa? Shouldn't someone do something about that? In fact, you might not know this, but the whole, the Scramble for Africa is a big event that happened where, you know, colonialism got really in fashion. For most of history, setting up colonies was this hugely expensive thing. You had to basically spend money, give money to your colony to like make it work. But Africa was around the time where people realized, wait, we could just get land and get resources. And, you know, like, Africa's very much the extractive based phase of colonialism. And so all of the European powers met and they said, we're all agreeing at a table where the lines will be and who gets what. And that's where people think of the modern, like, oh yeah, colonialism is when white people sit in a room and draw up lines, and to some extent that's true for Africa. But anyway, the point being is that like with Africa, this was set up on a balance of power. That's why the UK got this lovely straight line all the way down it, by the way. But like the reason this was the UK would have never got so much if they were trying to balance things and they were trying to say, wait, you have all of that, you really shouldn't be getting some of this continent right here. And the world history would have gone massively different. I mean, ultimately, like without the world wars, you don't have the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, which are basically just the allies who won World War II, but you don't have the same 5 allies, and maybe that means that instead of the Cold War being between the US and the Soviet Union, it's between the US and the UK, or maybe instead there's some other wild set of events. Really, once you go back in history far enough, once you alter something so big, you really do change everything that happens after that. But my point is just to say the US would not have become the world's foremost power in that way, and the UK could have never, again, had its moment in the sun just before that, and that is something that is kind of a beautiful fact of like, yes, countries are fully independent. The US cannot influence what happens in Spain, and Spain cannot influence what happens in the US. So, for a better example, Russia can't influence what happens in Argentina. Argentina can't influence what happens in Russia, but Russia can heavily influence what happens in Belarus, and in the same way, the United States can heavily influence what happens in Canada or Mexico, and there is this, there is like a influence that kind of exceeds your borders, and so by having two countries be a really close level of like friends without actually being officially together is kind of cheating the system of how countries work. When you look at the balance of power in Europe and you see 5 nations roughly in Western Europe that are about equal in power, Germany, France, Italy, Spain, the UK, when you see that, you're ignoring the fact that, like, wait a minute, does Germany have a giant industrial sector? You're ignoring the fact that, like, wait a minute, does Spain have all these islands over here? And wait, did Spain used to own, like, a substantial portion of the world? Is that what I'm learning from this? Like, how much, if Spain gave up all of these territories, but then also Mexico is a former Spanish colony, and so is Guatemala and Nicaragua, how are all these places former Spanish colonies? And I think the way Spain went, where they waited for revolutionary wars to happen and where they all kind of had their own separate independence thing, was maybe a bit worse than the UK system, where by losing a colony so early due to war, every other place that wanted to gain independence, partially because of influence from World War II and American influence on that one, but partially just by being like, wait, we can still be really good friends of this empire. We had the first peaceful split up of an empire that didn't lead to endless war, And I think, the trade-off of power from the UK being the foremost power in the world to the US happens seamlessly in a way that it's never happened before. Usually, when someone goes down, they go down kicking and screaming, and this is something which I think is good by having the US be such a close ally, but not the thing. And that's why if, hypothetically, right, if Canada was to become the world's next biggest power, let's just say all of this melts and it turns out there's diamonds under there or, whatever runs cars. There's electricity. We find giant blocks of electricity and now we can run the whole world economy. We can solve Western Europe's problem. Don't question it, okay? It's just all up there in northern Canada. Canada becomes the world's biggest power. The US would not be upset with Canada being the world's biggest power because they are close neighbors and friends and they've got this shared history on the east and the, I believe quite genuinely that as long as the transfer of power is between two countries that can see eye to eye, you don't have a world thermonuclear war in the way it was being threatened for like most of the last century between these two guys over here who literally could not be further apart, right? I guess they're so far apart they get close again on the other side of the world. But anyway, with that said, I hope you all enjoyed this video. Happy Independence Day if you are American, because I actually have been hiding this whole video. I'm not British. I pretend to be British because that's where the views are. But actually, I'm from the great state of Georgia. I'm actually from Paris, Georgia, if you all believe it. Is there not a Paris, Georgia? I must be from Paris, Tennessee then. No, Paris, Kentucky, actually. This is where I grew up in the Best Western, right down the street from the Walmart. I love Walmart as much as I love guns and Dairy Queen. But the only thing I love more than Dairy Queen is when you hit subscribe on this channel or give me money to buy one of these damn hamburgers down at the local hamburger factory. Oh, I go to Hardee's every day and I get me a great burger. When I drink too much, I drive down there in my tractor and the local police, the local sheriff, he likes to say, wow, good tractor you got there, but you gotta not drive that drunk again. And I say, what am I gonna do? And it's all great, because Paris, Tennessee is the greatest place on the planet. Happy Independence Day, my fellow Americans, and I'll see you in the next one, unless I die.